I want you to imagine a musician who somehow manages to cram 50 years of living into like just 5 short years.
Yeah, that's a lot of life.
Right. Imagine a guy who goes from this tiny rural village, a place where the buses don't even run, to becoming this massive global chart-topping superstar.
Total phenomena.
Exactly. And I want you to imagine that same musician at the absolute peak of his fame, casually predicting to a friend that his life is going to end by gunfire.
Because what's really wild is that he didn't just predict it,
Hmm.
He essentially wrote the soundtrack to it. He built this multi-million-dollar empire by rapping about the very forces that eventually killed him.
It's just a terrifying paradox.
Oh,
So
yeah.
today we are doing a deep dive into the very real, very tragic story of the Punjabi superstar Sidhu Moosewala, born Shubdeep Singh Sidhu.
Right.
And we're drawing on this phenomenal two-part BBC World Service documentary that really maps out his life, his groundbreaking music, and the massive investigation into his shocking assassination.
Yeah, the sources are incredibly detailed.
They really are. But I want to be clear for you listening, we're not just doing a standard true crime timeline here. This is it's basically a masterclass in understanding how modern cultural fusion, these deep historical political grievances, and the incredibly brutal economics of organized crime can all just violently collide.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's unpack this by looking at how Sidhu built this empire before we look at what actually tore it down. Because to understand Sidhu Moosewala, we really have to look at the pipeline between a tiny village in India and a suburb in Canada.
Yeah, so we all know Brampton.
Right.
In Canada, it acts as the beating heart of the Punjabi diaspora.
Right, the mother lode.
Exactly. It's the de facto capital of this very specific kind of musical fusion where deeply rooted traditional Punjabi culture just smashes right into North American hip-hop. But Sidhu's journey to get there actually starts in the village of Musa in the Mansa district of Punjab.
Hence the name.
Right. He was intensely proud of his roots. He literally took the village name as his stage name. Moosewala basically means the man from Musa.
Okay.
And he grew up singing these traditional Punjabi folk songs. They're called var in school. So he's building this incredibly rich cultural foundation. But like a lot of youth in his position who are seeking better educational and economic opportunities, he moved to Canada.
Right, and he steps off the plane in Brampton, and he just becomes the absolute perfect catalyst for that diaspora fusion. I mean, he links up with Canadian producers, most notably this guy, Big Bird, who was crafting these really high-quality, international-level hip-hop and trap beats.
Yeah, those beats were heavy.
Super heavy. When you take those aggressive 808 and bass lines and you layer Sidhu's raw, like incredibly powerful rural Punjabi vocals over them.
Which they did on that breakthrough track so high.
Yes,
Yeah.
so high. It's just an instant explosion. I mean, it wasn't just a hit. It was a total cultural reset that broke through in Canada, the UK, and obviously back home in India.
And, the persona he constructed to carry that sound, it was very deliberate. He was a real student of hip-hop history. He was completely fascinated by Tupac Shakur.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, and if you look at Tupac, he embodied this captivating duality, right?
Yeah.
On one hand, he was this fiercely intelligent activist reading Machiavelli, wanting to, spark the brain that will change the world.
Right,
But on the other hand, he was heavily immersed in the gangster lifestyle.
right.
The guns, the machismo, that definitive 90s bravado,
Mhm.
and Sidhu just absorbed that blueprint entirely.
I mean, think about the psychology of that for a second. For a kid from a dusty rural village, suddenly thrust into the freezing winters of a foreign country where you don't really have a footing yet, adopting that gangster hip-hop persona is almost like putting on a suit of armor.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
It's the psychological tool, right? To project absolute invincibility in a place where you initially hold zero power. You wrap yourself in the aesthetics of danger so nobody messes with you.
But what's fascinating here is the sheer danger of adopting that specific armor in the specific ecosystem he was entering.
Right.
Because role-playing a gangster in your music videos, brandishing weapons, talking about taking out your enemies, projecting dominance, that's just standard operating procedure in hip-hop.
Sure, everybody does it.
Right. But Sidhu wasn't doing this in a vacuum. He was doing it in an industry and eventually a geographic region that was deeply entangled with actual lethal organized crime syndicates.
Oh, man.
He was playing a character, utilizing the tropes of the genre, but the people listening to those lyrics on the streets of Punjab and British Columbia, they weren't playing. They were living it.
And fame acts as a beacon, doesn't it? When you project immense wealth, power, and defiance in the booming Punjabi music scene, the people who operate in the shadows inevitably take notice, and they want their cut.
They demand a cut, and they absolutely have the muscle to enforce it. The business model of the gangs operating between Canada and India, it underwent this terrifying evolution.
How so?
Well, historically, organized crime relies on straightforward extortion rackets, right? You pay them protection money in cash to ensure they don't break your kneecaps or burn down your studio.
The classic mob shakedown.
Exactly. But as the diaspora music industry exploded and these artists started pulling in massive revenue from global streaming platforms like Spotify and YouTube, plus international stadium tours, the gangs adapted. They realized that a bag of cash is just a one-time payout.
Right. I want you listening to imagine this for a second. Imagine you've just built this wildly successful startup, right? Or written the biggest hit of the decade in your bedroom studio. A violent cartel kicks down your door, but they don't want the cash in your bank account today. They want the digital royalty checks your grandchildren are supposed to inherit.
That is precisely the mechanism. The gangs moved from extorting cash to extorting intellectual property.
That is insane.
It's brilliant, but terrifying. They would force artists, often at gunpoint or through relentless death threats to their families back home, to sign over the digital rights to their tracks. They would hijack the back-end distribution, funneling all those streaming royalties into shell companies they controlled.
It's a highly sophisticated modernization of the shakedown. So how does a self-made farmer's son from Musa react when a transnational syndicate demands the rights to the music he built from absolutely nothing?
He refuses.
He pushes back with an intensity that, frankly, borders on suicidal. I mean, he starts getting these threat calls, right?
Yeah, gangsters were explicitly warning him not to perform in Edmonton, Canada, promising to kill him if he steps on that stage.
And instead of canceling the show, he walks out under the stadium lights and publicly defies them. He shouts to the crowd that he could, quote, handle 10 on my own.
Wow.
And he writes a song, East Side Flow, where he casually raps about receiving death threats every morning with his cup of tea.
The tension there is just palpable. Because Sidhu felt this deep, intrinsic pride in his success. He felt he had earned every dollar and every stream, and he absolutely refused to bow to extortionists who were just exploiting the very culture he was popularizing.
Which is commendable, but
But by answering their private, violent threats with his own public, lyrical threats, he was escalating a feud with people who literally murder for a living. He was treating a lethal threat like a standard rap beef.
right. And eventually, the heat of this Canadian extortion environment, combined with, I think, a profound desire to solidify his cultural roots and legitimize his status back home, it pulls him back to India. But he isn't just returning to the quiet village life. He steps onto a totally different, vastly more complicated battlefield.
Yeah, in 2018, he plays his first major live concert in India at Punjab University. Now, we really have to understand what Punjab University represents.
It's not just a regular college.
Not at all. It is not just an academic institution with frat houses and debate clubs. It is a major political power center. It serves as the primary training ground for regional and national politicians.
Okay.
And in this hypercharged environment, student politics frequently cross the line into outright thuggery, intimidation, and gang recruitment. Student union elections look more like high-stakes state elections, complete with convoys of SUVs and armed muscle.
It's the ultimate proving ground for aspiring politicians to demonstrate how much muscle they command. And into this powder keg walks Sidhu Moosewala. I mean, they expected a few thousand students to show up. He brings out a roaring crowd of over 12,000.
Unbelievable, Cole.
And he doesn't just play his club bangers. Here's where it gets really interesting. Sidhu transitions from singing about driving black Cadillacs and wearing designer clothes to singing about deep-seated generational historical grievances. He turned himself into a cultural lightning rod for the establishment, basically grounding decades of unspoken political static into a single, highly visible flashpoint.
Yeah. And looking at the history of 1984, the BBC sources show us two starkly different realities that still define Punjab today. Specifically, we're talking about Operation Blue Star.
Right, and just to be totally clear to you listening, we are simply reporting the historical context provided by the sources here. We are not taking any political stance or endorsing any viewpoints, just laying out what the documentary details.
Absolutely. So, Operation Blue Star was a military operation ordered by the Indian government to assault the Golden Temple in Amritsar, which is the holiest shrine in the Sikh religion. The state's objective was to capture Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale and his armed supporters, who had heavily fortified the complex.
Okay.
To the government at the time and to a large portion of the Indian public, Bhindranwale was a dangerous militant who posed a severe threat to national security and had to be neutralized.
But if you look through the eyes of Sidhu and his millions of supporters, the sources note you see a completely different narrative. To many Sikhs, Bhindranwale is considered a revered martyr who died defending their faith against an oppressive state.
Right.
The military operation resulted in a horrific massacre, deeply damaged the sacred temple, and triggered a chain of events including the assassination of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and subsequent anti-Sikh pogroms. Again, we're not here to litigate that history, but you simply cannot understand Sidhu's music without understanding these two colliding viewpoints. That era left a profound, lingering generational trauma across Punjab.
It really did. And for decades, mainstream Punjabi pop artists wouldn't dare touch that history. It was considered too raw, too commercially risky, and frankly, just too dangerous.
Yeah, career suicide, or literal suicide.
But Sidhu leaned into it. He utilized visual imagery and lyrical callbacks in his music that directly connected with youth who weren't even alive in 1984, but still carried those cultural scars.
Yeah.
He publicly expressed reverence for figures like Bhindranwale.
He essentially grabs the third rail of Indian politics with both hands, and this political awakening, it really reaches a fever pitch during the massive 2020 farmers' protests.
Oh, that was a huge moment.
Massive. Tens of thousands of farmers marched on Delhi, setting up massive encampments to protest new agricultural reforms they believed would destroy their livelihoods. And Sidhu didn't just tweet his support, he was on the front lines. He organized massive tractor rallies, he was a farmer's son first, and he made sure the world knew it.
He released a track during this period simply titled Punjab. And it wasn't just a song of support, it was a battle cry. He explicitly warned the central government in Delhi, singing lyrics to the effect of, "If you lay hands on our turbans, we'll bring you down."
Wow.
He fundamentally transformed his brand. He went from being a chart-topping pop star to being the voice of political resistance for the working class and the rural youth.
And that kind of evolution amplifies your power immensely. When your voice becomes the anthem for a massive real-world political movement that eventually forces the government to repeal those laws, you transcend entertainment. You become a genuine political force.
Me too.
But when you poke the eye of the national government and establish that kind of grassroots power, you paint a massive target on your back.
You become a threat to multiple power structures simultaneously. Think about it. You have a global megastar who is actively defying international extortion syndicates, challenging the national government, and swimming in the murky, violent waters of Punjabi student politics.
It's a recipe for disaster.
And all these volatile elements finally intersect at, of all things, a traditional sporting event.
Kabaddi. If you haven't seen it, Kabaddi is a highly physical, incredibly intense contact sport. It's somewhat akin to rugby, but without a ball. And it is deeply embedded in rural Punjabi culture.
Very deeply.
But there is a dark side to these tournaments, right? The infrastructure of the sport is heavily infiltrated and in some cases entirely controlled by organized crime.
Gangs view Kabaddi tournaments as incredibly lucrative ventures. They run the massive underground betting rings, they actively fix the matches by intimidating players, and they organize the highly profitable music concerts that serve as the halftime shows.
Right, the halftime shows.
Exactly. So entering this space means doing business with the underworld.
Yeah.
And this is exactly where Sidhu gets caught between two extremely dangerous, heavily armed rival factions.
Okay, so on one side of this turf war, you have the Bambiha gang. Sidhu was connected to this faction through a close friend of his, Mandeep Dhaliwal. And on the opposing side, you have the Bishnoi gang.
Who are major players.
It's massive. A criminal syndicate led by Lawrence Bishnoi, who, remarkably, was running the entire operation from inside a high-security prison, and his key associate, Goldie Brar, who was operating the Canadian arm of the syndicate.
And the fatal catalyst occurred at a Kabaddi match organized by the Bambiha gang. Sidhu was booked to perform, and during his set, right in front of the massive crowd and all the cameras, Sidhu performed the Thapi.
The Tapi. For those who don't know, it's this highly charged, traditional gesture where you aggressively slap your thigh and raise your hand. In Punjabi culture, it is the ultimate show of bravado, dominance, and public defiance. It's essentially a physical challenge.
Yeah.
And Sidhu did this while performing on the home turf of the Bambiha gang, implicitly directing the challenge at their rivals, the Bishnoi gang.
And in the ecosystem of organized crime, disrespect is a currency you pay for with blood. The Bishnoi gang took the Tapi as a deeply personal, unforgivable public insult. Lawrence Bishnoi and Goldie Brar were reportedly furious.
I can imagine.
However, an immediate bloodbath was actually avoided thanks to a singular figure, Vicky Midukara.
Ah, Vicky. He is arguably one of the most fascinating characters in this entire tragic saga. He's a charismatic former student leader who had successfully transitioned into mainstream politics. But his true value on the streets was his role as a peacekeeper. He's described in the doc as a thermocol.
A thermocol?
Yeah, it's like the styrofoam shock absorber you put in a box to keep fragile things from shattering.
That is a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Because in a world populated by heavily armed men with incredibly fragile egos, a shock absorber is the only thing preventing total war. Vicky was uniquely positioned. He was incredibly close to Lawrence Bishnoi and Goldie Brar, functioning almost as an older brother figure to them.
Right.
But he also maintained deep connections across the political and musical landscapes, including with Sidhu's camp. He stepped in, cooled the tempers, and effectively smoothed over the insult of the Thapi. He kept the peace.
But then, in August 2021, the shock absorber is violently removed. Vicky Midukara is chased down a street by masked gunmen and assassinated. And the Bambiha gang publicly claims responsibility for the hit. This is the exact moment the web completely entangles Sidhu Moosewala.
Yeah. During the intense police investigation into Vicky's assassination, a name surfaces, Shaganpreet Singh. Shaganpreet was a very close friend and occasional manager for Sidhu.
Okay.
The police alleged that Shaganpreet played a crucial logistical role in the murder, providing the getaway car and safe house accommodation for the shooters. And before the police can apprehend him, Shaganpreet flees the country to Australia.
So for Goldie Brar and the Bishnoi gang, the docs just connect themselves perfectly. They operate on street logic. If Shaganpreet was Sidhu's manager, they reason that Sidhu must have been the financial and political mastermind behind the murder of their beloved mentor, Vicky.
They become utterly convinced of it.
They believe Sidhu used his vast wealth, his celebrity status, and his political connections to orchestrate the hit and then protect the killers, helping them escape international borders.
Sidhu vehemently and publicly denied any involvement, of course. He challenged them, essentially saying, if I've done something wrong, bring the evidence to the police. But in the court of gangland opinion, the verdict was already rendered.
I have to pause here, though, and push back on a narrative that sometimes emerges. The idea that Sidhu was just an innocent, trapped victim who realized too late that his friends were dangerous. Was he really trapped, or was he blinded by his own sense of invincibility?
It's a tough question.
We're talking about a guy who openly fraternized with known gang members, who wrote songs glorifying this exact lifestyle, and who played the political game in a notoriously corrupt system. He basically walked into the lion's den wearing a suit made of raw meat.
That is a harsh but necessary critique. Sidhu was undeniably drawn to proximity to power, whether that power was political or criminal. He utilized those connections to build his empire. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to understand the specific environment of Punjab's ganglands. It's often described as a modern wild, wild west.
Yeah, no rules.
Exactly. In that ecosystem, empirical truth and police evidence are vastly less important than perception. Once the mediator, the thermocol, was dead, the fragile architecture of street politics collapsed. The Bishnoi gang perceived Sidhu as guilty, and in a world without mediators or trust in the legal system, violence becomes the only remaining language of dispute resolution.
And that horrific language was spoken on a Sunday evening in May 2022. Sidhu leaves his house in his home village of Musa. He is driving his Thar Jeep, which is a rugged vehicle that's practically a symbol of Punjabi pride.
Right.
And crucially, inexplicably, he is traveling without his bulletproof vehicle and without his state-assigned security detail.
For a man who'd received relentless death threats and knew a massive syndicate held him responsible for a high-profile assassination, it was a catastrophic lapse in security.
True.
The assassins had been hunting him for months. They had established a highly coordinated network. On that day, they had lookouts doing a real-time re-ace of his house. There were individuals posing as fans, taking selfies with Sidhu just moments before he climbed into his Jeep.
Oh.
And they were simultaneously feeding his exact movements and his lack of security to Goldie Brar.
So 2 vehicles, a Corolla and a Bolero, tail Sidhu through the village streets. They execute a textbook ambush, forcing his Jeep off the road and into a brick wall. Heavily armed shooters surround the vehicle and open fire with automatic weapons. Sidhu Moosewala is pronounced dead on arrival at the local hospital. He was only 28 years old.
It's heartbreaking. And the aftermath is just as chilling as the murder itself. Goldie Brar immediately releases voice notes to journalists, openly and proudly claiming responsibility on behalf of the Bishnoi gang.
Just brazen.
Completely. And his justification is a masterclass in criminal rationalization. He frames it as gangland justice. He argues that the Indian legal system is inherently corrupt, designed only to protect the rich and powerful. He claims that a superstar like Sidhu would never face consequences in a legitimate courtroom for his alleged role in Vicky's murder. Therefore, the gang had a moral obligation to act as judge, jury, and executioners.
Quote, "When decency falls on deaf ears, it's the gunshot that gets heard." That is an actual quote from Goldie Brar's voice note.
It sounds like a movie script.
It sounds exactly like a line scripted for a mafia movie, but it's the grim reality of street justice. And yet, there is a twist in this narrative that makes the whole tragedy infinitely darker. Because beneath the rhetoric of honor and revenge, there was a brutally cynical economic motive, wasn't there?
This raises an important question. In the modern attention economy, who truly benefits financially when an artist of this magnitude is slaughtered? The reality is that this assassination functioned as a twisted, incredibly effective marketing campaign for the Bishnoi gang.
Because before May 2022, Lawrence Bishnoi and Goldie Brar were certainly feared within specific regional criminal circles, but they were not global household names.
No. But by executing Sidhu Moosewala, the gang violently absorbed his massive global fame. They hijacked his cultural relevance and transmuted it into their own terrifying international notoriety, and they immediately monetized that notoriety. In the weeks and months following the murder, extortion calls across Punjab and the diaspora absolutely skyrocketed.
The mechanism of their business completely changed. Gangsters were no longer just calling up rival criminals or mega celebrities. They were calling local businessmen, doctors, real estate developers, demanding ruinous sums of money.
Right.
And they no longer had to prove they were dangerous. They simply had to pick up the phone and say, "It's Goldie." The implicit threat was, "We killed a man with millions of fans and political protection. We will not hesitate to kill you." Imagine picking up your phone and hearing a voice say, "Sell your house, sell your kidney, I don't care, just pay." They weaponized Sidhu's death, turning it into a highly scalable business of fear.
The Bishnoi gang calculated that by eliminating him, they had silenced a rival and exponentially boosted their brand's market value. But, the profound tragic irony of this entire saga is that in their brutal attempt to silence him, they cemented his legacy. They transformed a mortal superstar into an immortal cultural martyr.
Which brings us back to that haunting detail, the moment where Sidhu casually turned to a friend and said, "When I die, I'm going to die by bullets."
He knew.
He absolutely knew.
He was writing lyrics about people plotting his demise to steal his fame. He saw the inevitable conclusion of the path he was walking.
He was a highly intelligent man who lived with a terrifying, hypervigilant awareness of the lethal forces he was dancing with every time he stepped up to a microphone. So, what does this all mean for you and me? We've just navigated the blindingly fast, incredibly complex life of a farmer's son who evolved into a modern-day poet. He masterfully merged the traditional soul of rural Punjab with the aggressive, booming beats of Western hip-hop. He gave a powerful, unignorable voice to decades of historical pain, and then he was utterly consumed by the dark, extortionist underbelly of the very culture he helped popularize.
I believe his story forces a necessary, really uncomfortable reflection on our own media consumption. We stream the tracks on our commute, we watch the highly stylized cinematic music videos featuring the guns, the gang signs, and the bravado, and we compartmentalize it strictly as entertainment.
Right, it's just a song.
But we voraciously consume art about deeply dangerous lifestyles without recognizing the mechanisms of reality. That there are very real, very lethal forces operating just off stage, managing the ledgers, and waiting to violently extract their cut.
It stops being a performance the second real bullets shatter the glass. Which leaves us with this final thought to ponder as we close out. We talked at the beginning about a man who crammed half a century of living into 5 explosive years. In our current digital era, where social media fame translates directly into tangible geopolitical influence and unimaginable streams of revenue, does the very architecture of modern celebrity inherently demand that artists play a deadly game of brinkmanship? Are we, as an audience, funding an ecosystem where, for an artist to truly go viral and maintain dominance, their actual physical survival becomes a secondary concern to their mythology?
It's an incredibly dark question. But when you look at the mechanics of Sidhu Moosewala's rise and fall, it's a question we can no longer afford to ignore.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time. I want you to imagine a musician who somehow manages to cram 50 years of living into like just 5 short years.
Yeah, that's a lot of life.
Right. Imagine a guy who goes from this tiny rural village, a place where the buses don't even run, to becoming this massive, global, chart-topping superstar.
Total phenomena.
Exactly. And I want you to imagine that same musician at the absolute peak of his fame, casually predicting to a friend that his life is going to end by gunfire.
Because what's really wild is that he didn't just predict it, you know?
Hmm.
He essentially wrote the soundtrack to it. He built this multi-million-dollar empire by rapping about the very forces that eventually killed him.
It's just a terrifying paradox.
Oh,
So
yeah.
today we are doing a deep dive into the very real, very tragic story of the Punjabi superstar Sidhu Moosewala, born Shubdeep Singh Sidhu.
Right.
And we're drawing on this phenomenal two-part BBC World Service documentary that really maps out his life, his groundbreaking music, and the massive investigation into his shocking assassination.
Yeah, the sources are incredibly detailed.
They really are. But I want to be clear for you listening, we're not just doing a standard true crime timeline here. This is it's basically a masterclass in understanding how modern cultural fusion, these deep historical political grievances, and the incredibly brutal economics of organized crime can all just violently collide.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's unpack this by looking at how Sidhu built this empire before we look at what actually tore it down. Because to understand Sidhu Moosewala, we really have to look at the pipeline between a tiny village in India and a suburb in Canada.
Yeah, so we all know Brampton.
Right.
In Canada, it acts as the beating heart of the Punjabi diaspora.
Right, the mother lode.
Exactly. It's the de facto capital of this very specific kind of musical fusion where deeply rooted traditional Punjabi culture just smashes right into North American hip-hop. But Sidhu's journey to get there actually starts in the village of Musa in the Mansa district of Punjab.